Hello friends and welcome. So this is a follow-up video to my last video, link in the description, in which I had four concepts that I discussed, and on one of them I got a question from Tomasz, who commented, and I want to have a look at that, what he commented. And here is his comments, and I think he makes some very good points, and I think some of the other points are a bit based in actual experience. I think they have some different causations and things going on rather than what is concluded in his comments. So, and then finally, I also want to mention some of the research on the missing fundamental, and I want to point out in the graph how you can actually interpret it, how you should interpret it, how you should be using it, and what the missing fundamental, how it plays into this. So, I'm going to read out Thomas's question, and Thomas, thank you for posting this question and comment. You make a couple of assertions, so I'll go through it, but I'll read it out first. So, Thomas says, I have a slightly different conclusions from the human ear distortion graph. If we listen to a completion distortionless system at 60 dB level, then our ear will create a distortion according to this graph that you showed it. And he's talking about this graph. For those who haven't seen it, it basically says that, for example, these lines represent the harmonic distortions in our ear, and which are created by our ear, so our measuring instrument, and they get compensated for in the brain. So at 90 decibels, if you see here the second harmonic, it's at minus 12 dB, so at 78 dB registers the second harmonic. So if a 1 kilohertz tone is playing at 90 dB, you will hear at 78 dB, you'll hear a 2 kilohertz tone, and your brain will actually compensate for that. It will actually even, hearing that, it will actually even help your brain hear the fundamental of that tone. So that's what this graph is. But Thomas goes, okay, but he says now, if the system is distorting, he suggests that what it is doing is it will combine it with the human ear distortion that you see here and add it up. So it creates then the distortion profile of something that is louder. And Thomas, that would be true, that the distortion profile would look like something louder, on the proviso, of course, that your distortion profile of your system is exactly the same as this profile here. So he then says it will create. So our brain will be tricked in thinking it is louder. Well, I don't think there's any research to back that up, but I'll get into that. Yes, it will sound distortionless to the brain as it will cancel out, but I feel your explanation is lagging. If the system distortion and human ear distortion are summing, and yes, I think that's correct, and then why the brain cancel it out, it would just having more distortion. Why would the brain cancel it having more distortion than it is used to? And that's correct, you will actually hear it, but I think it's also a matter of proportion. So again, we'll get into it. I think that interpreting the sound as louder by brain is the answer. And the louder sounds better. The same principles as turning on the loudness on EQ, fooling ourselves that the music is actually louder than it actually is. So let's get into the different aspects. So the summing element. This is correct, of course. If your distortion, if something is playing, so you have to separate, let's do two things. First of all, this spectrum. So if you have a system that is 30% distortion, let's talk about proportion first. If I have a system that is 30% distortion, which is the same as the second harmonic distortion in our ear, you will actually hear that. So from that we can conclude, yes, it is summing. However, if it's at a lower level, it's 5%, you will struggle to hear it. You might not even hear it at all. And I'm quite aware of how the different distortion spectra sound. So the second, the third, and the fifth, I can detect that in music. Fourth, I haven't clued into yet what the specifics is, but each has a specific way of transforming the music. So once you, and because I measure and also build and improve amps, I'm getting more and more aware of this. But so yes, it's summing up, and we'll get into the later how then to use it. But it gets summed up, but you have to see the proportion. So if you have 5% with 30% internally, it is in the margin of error of this, and it's so, even if you would detect it, it sounds very natural to you. It won't be obnoxious distortion. And the key aspect is proportion, but also the spectra of distortion. Because if I would then remove the second harmonic here and only have the third playing at the same level as it was, so say the second harmonic was 5% distorting and this one is 1% distorting, and then I remove the second harmonic from this spectrum, then I will suddenly start hearing the third harmonic, because it is now not just a normal spectrum that you expect with your ear. Now we've removed one and suddenly I've got the fundamental here, and I've got third, fourth and fifth. And you can do these experiments, of course, by applying digital IQ and just removing that thing and then see what happens. But your ear will immediately then pick up on the third, and you will think the characteristics will be that it's a bit cold, analytical, mechanical. All of those things come through with the third. And I'll preface you, the fifth is actually the harmonic distortion that you will perceive as it's sounding louder than it is. So when you add the fifth harmonics, for example, small tube amps that are being played really near their limits will produce a lot of fifth, and you will get the impression that it sounds louder, and it's because of the fifth harmonic. So that's another element. So the way to read this graph, and we'll get into the loudness aspect, Thomas, that you mentioned in a second, is that you need to stay in the shadow of these proportions of distortion with your, and the shadow means not equaling it, because you'll hear it. From my own experience, I know you can hear these things, but if you stay within the spectrum, it sounds very natural to your ear, even though there's a small change, even though if the levels are too high, it will actually be fatiguing. But you can make use of the shadow almost that it creates. So if you stay in the shadows with your system and you match it in volume and you match it in spectrum, you stay under it. That's the most important thing. That's what you can use here. So indeed it is summing. So I agree with you there. It is summing, and it will, if it rises over it, but especially when you don't mimic the spectrum, you will hear it. So a 1% THD, your third harmonic, will be not audible if it is in a natural spectrum, but it will be audible if it's only by itself. Then the levels need to be way lower for audibility. And a lot of, by the way, research that you've seen on this topic and the audibility of these things is completely dependent on the spectra, and a lot of research actually omits it, even though this older research did it properly. I think that interpreting the sound as louder by the brain is the answer. No, I wouldn't agree with your point here. And the reason is, I think there's two things going on. If we look at the research that is available on how we perceive loudness, we actually, the human ear actually has in the different, it measures the sound pressure level relatively to each other within the frequency spectrum. So there's certain bands, and if you take a weighted average through these bands of the sound pressure levels and that corresponds with the phone curves, our ear sensitivity, it will take that all together and will create a loudness. I haven't seen any research that says that loudness is based on the distortion levels. I haven't heard that you're proposing this. I don't think that's the way we measure loudness. If you have any evidence for that, let me know. However, what you might confuse it with, which some sort of relates to it, is of course that, and you see this especially with women listening to stereo systems, they often ask you to turn it down because they have a better hearing and they're more attuned to distortion, I would say. And so if the distortion levels go up, what you'll tend to see is that you want to turn it down. So it is too loud for you to be processed. And what I noticed in my amp building is that as you improve your amp, you can actually play it louder without fatiguing. And so the perceived overload of your loudness is less. But I think that aspect is different from the loudness volume just by itself. So I think you're onto something, and it matches your experience, but I would say you have to separate what's what. Same principle as turning on the loudness for on EQ, the smile filter, so where you bump the lows and the highs. Now again, and you say louder is better, sounds better, and I would contest that, but let's hear with EQ. So one of the things is that our hearing is very sensitive in the middle, so if your system screws up and you apply an EQ, and that EQ is like this, what a lot of people do, especially on lousy systems, but I find that as your system improves, you have less and less need to EQ it out. You might still do room equalization, but you're not going to shape your profile. It's only when your amp or your speakers are actually not functioning properly that you intend to do the EQ. So what you do is you bump up because your amp sounds so dreadful and so distorting and so awful when you turn it up. What you do is you remove the aspect where you're most sensitive, and you might bump up where you have hearing damage, so the highs and the lows, you might bump that up, and then you can crank it up because it doesn't overload your hearing, and it probably maybe even works instead. And so I see that effect a lot, but I don't think that that has any to do with these graphs. It just more has to do with how your system is distorting, and the fact that you're just finding ways of tuning your way around it, so you can actually play it louder and get the physical impact of that music without it driving you nuts. If you had a very good system, what I also noticed at parties where I had electrostat speakers, and you turn them up, they can be much higher than other loudspeakers turned up, because they just distort a lot less, and they have a much gentler distortion profile, and then people are able to live with the louder sounds better. Now you also say here louder sounds better. Well, if you have more distortion, I don't think louder will sound better. What I think is happening is you have two effects with louder sounds better. On very inefficient loudspeaker systems, what I find is you have a fraction of a percent that actually gets where the membrane is moving, that actually gets translated into energy that goes into the air. So most of the energy is just spent on the friction and trying this membrane to move. 99%, more than 99% is spent of your energy is just spent on overcoming this internal resistance of your membrane and the spider and everything that is used. But it doesn't matter whether it's a woofer or a tweeter. So when you're overcoming that and it's still dealing with its own resistance, it won't produce any sound that is good. And that's why I see that on such systems that the detail on low levels is completely crushed. Your bass completely is demolished. Like you don't have any bass. The details are gone. It sounds crappy when it's on a low volume. Whereas with high efficiency speakers, you can turn down the volume and you still hear everything, and you still hear a bass. It's not a pressurized bass, but you still hear it, the low tones, especially if it's not a pressurized system. So there you need to turn it up, and you need to turn it up because amps usually produce their best sound sort of when it's sort of playing at 20-25% of its maximum output capacity. Probably around 20, maybe a sixth or a fifth of its output power, is my experience, and so you have that, and combined with the power of your amplifier and your speaker, you'll have often the louder sounds better. But again, it is particularly for low efficiency systems, and perhaps also for amps that have far more power than you normally need. And the other aspect is, what I would say is with volume, is that every track, of course, is mixed. This is the final thing, and then I'll get to the missing fundamentals. So the final thing about louder sounds better, I would say often what you're looking for, and many people argue this, is that you want the volume to be the same as it was mixed, because of our hearing is the sensitivity curves, the phone curves are so different over the frequency bands. When we replay it, and we want to replay it the same way it was mixed, so then everything is in proportion as it was in the mixing table. When you have that volume recreated at your listening position, the same as the mixer it had, suddenly you'll see that how the music was put together, all the different tracks, and was blended together in the studio, in the mixing studio and the mastering, you'll see that it sort of starts aligning and sounds good, because suddenly everything has that same phone curve, it is done at the same curve. And then you need a EQ, as you said, to often, if you would have it playing softer or louder, you'll apply EQ to compensate for the level that you're playing it at compared to that. And that's a very crude tool usually. But that is also often going on with volume. So there will be it's not necessarily, I would say, that louder sounds better all the time. Often it sounds worse because systems start distorting more. But there will be a volume in which the proportion of the music is most closest to what the mixer intended. So I think you have a lot of things that you observe that are going on, but I think that some of them have different causes. So I hope I made that sort of the distinction a bit clear in that. And by the way, thank you for posting this question. I can't always, especially in a half-hour long video, I can't touch on everything. So questions like this can help sort of bring out things and sort of open up more discussion and insight. So this graph, just see it as stay in the shadow of this and the proportionality and the levels of it. That's how you should use this graph. I think you should interpret it. It's sort of the mask, the bigger mask that is put on our hearing. And so if we stay within that, we stay behind that mask, it can't be detected by our hearing very much. Get closer to it and it starts becoming obvious, because it does some, as you suggest. So the missing fundamental, that's the last topic that I want to just talk about. What happens with our ear? So what they found is that if you have this distortion spectra and you remove the original tone, so you remove the input at full level, what happens is that if they had the full signal here, right, and you remove the original signal, but you have all the overtones present, your hearing will actually make up the missing fundamental. And there's research on that. Look up missing fundamentals and you'll find it. So what that suggests to us is that this distortion, if it relates to our ear spectrum, actually helps us be able to listen to the original tone, because it's already inspected. So our ear is not just masking it out. It says, well, if I've got this information, then it must be a fundamental tone. And that helps us, for example, in the low regions, in the bass region, because in the bass region we're very insensitive, and we're actually psychoacoustically, the overtones will actually be louder and outshine the fundamentals. So we then use this spectrum to hear the fundamental. Also Nelson Paas says this, that second harmonics can actually help us hear. So it actually has it's sort of almost a hearing aid effect. So that is another aspect that you already can sort of, if you think about the masking and the processing, it also is an information source that the ear then actually uses. And one practical example is, I think where I heard this happen was actually with the Carlson speakers that my brother had. So he had for a long time, he had a pair of Carlson speakers, and Carlson speakers have don't need a baffle step filter, because its bass performance is boosted, but then it drops off sort of under 50 Hertz, depending on the size of what you have there and the type of drivers that you use. But what I always found is that with this speaker, even though it dropped under 50 Hertz, it didn't feel like it was lacking. It didn't feel like a bookshelf speaker, strangely enough. And I think one of the things was that it actually made use of the missing fundamentals, because it sounded always like it went quite deep. And it was probably only by suggestion of the overtones. I don't know exactly, I can't say it, but it was the only speaker design that I've heard that I never felt the bass was lacking despite it rolling off quite heavily under 50 Hertz. So that's how to use this graph. Thank you for your question again, Thomas. I hope this sort of clears things up a little bit and fills in some of the blanks. And so yeah, that's it for now. Thank you for tuning into my channel, and I hope to catch you in the next video. Until then, have a brilliant day, have a brilliant week, and catch you soon. Bye bye.